Let's keep this conversation going with Dennis Kelleher. He's the CEO of Better Markets. Dennis' latest notes provides several key questions that he would have had for Jay Powell to answer. And I want to start with one of those questions, which actually was asked of him, Dennis, and that was about the banking sector and some of the moves that I think some of the members of Congress wanted to see made coming off of that regional banking collapse back in March. Basically, Powell said they're still working on it.
Yeah, and that's good news that they're working on it. The bad news is that they need to be acting with a lot more urgency. We've been saying for a long time that we need regulators who act with as much urgency to prevent the next crash as they do responding to the last crash. What happens is, a crash happens, they put their cape on, they fly into action, they dispense $30+ billion in capital to prevent bank failures. Then they do a 113-page report talking about all these things that are wrong in supervision and regulation. And they say, oh, and now we're going to spend a couple of years writing some rules to maybe address those things. By the time they're done with that process, there'll be another crash and crisis. So what we really need is some real urgency here with the regulators, in our view, enacting what are called interim final rules, which are effective immediately upon enactment. And that could address some of the more fundamental, well-known, widely agreed to causes of the last crash.
It's interesting that while Jay Powell was speaking before the House of Representatives of Committee, there was a Senate committee hearing taking place with three nominees to the Fed, two who are currently on the Fed, Philip Jefferson and Lisa Cook, and a third, Ariana Kugler, who would be joining. I thought it was interesting, comments out of Jefferson as well as Cook, specifically on the banking crisis, Dennis. They kind of made this idea that any new rule should still be tailored to the size of the institutions.
Well, I was at that hearing, and I can tell you that it was good news to hear them say that, because there is not a one-size-fits-all in regulation. Frankly, there never has been. That's been an industry talking point to beat back even modest common sense regulations. Both Dr. Cook and Dr. Jefferson, as well as the nominee, Dr. Kugler, all said that what we need is risk-based, tailored approaches. So asset size is one of the things that happens, but it's also relating to their activities. If they've got a global footprint with a big derivatives book, that's completely different than the 4,000 or so community banks in this country who are so vital to the economy and our communities. Do you know over 40% of small business loans are done by small community banks? And one of the real victims of the Silicon Valley bank crash, the First Republic bank crash, were the community banks. They got hit the hardest. They are innocent victims of a system of banks over $100 billion that are not properly regulated and that are not properly supervised. And that's another reason why we need some urgency here.
And to be fair, I mean, Philip Jefferson did kind of, I'll talk, one of the questions, I remember he did kind of talk about striking this balance between new regulations, new capital requirements, and of course, the need to make sure that these banks are still actually lending in a way that supports those small mid-sized businesses.
Right, but it's a false talking point to say there's a trade-off between financial stability and bank resilience and lending to the real economy. One of the only things standing between a failing bank and a taxpayer bailout is the amount of capital that it has. And the more capital it has, by the way, the lower the cost of its capital, and therefore the greater lending it should be able to do. Additionally, if banks need more capital, and we believe they need substantially more capital, when I say banks, I'm talking about above $100 billion in assets. There's a lot of ways to do that. They could keep retained earnings. They're kicking out tens of billions of dollars a year in shareholder buybacks and dividends. All of those could be retained earnings. If they were really concerned and focused on lending to the real productive economy, there's a lot of ways that they could boost their capital, which would boost their resilience and enable them to actually increase their lending. They don't do that because when they have lower capital, lower equity, they have higher leverage, and the executives' compensation is based on ROE, return on equity, and a big part of that is based on leverage, which amplifies their compensation. That's at bottom what's going on here. So the trade-off is, should we be worried about a financial system and have a financial system that supports the productive economy and supports our communities, or do we want to swing for the fences, low capital banking system that's high risk for the country but great for the executives?
Well, unfortunately, I hate to say it, Dennis, I feel like we're already there. It'll be interesting to see whether that gets righted or pulled back. And of course, still awaiting that big report from Michael Barr. I guess it'll be some time before we get to that. Dennis, going to have to leave it there. Dennis Kelleher over at Better Markets, a huge presence in Washington, D.C., nonprofit, of course, established to make finance and government serve society a little bit better.